Galactic Council warned, humans don't bargain with murderers, all shocked. The feed hit my console at 300 shipboard time. I was already awake. I had been awake for an hour running trade proposal numbers for the Luvari delegation when the priority alert came through. The kind of alert that bypasses every filter, every noise protocol, every sleep setting you have ever configured. The kind that goes straight to your screen in red. I read it once, then I read it again. Kepler's Reach Colony, population 4,211, mining settlement, established 11 years ago. Families mostly. Engineers, technicians, children born right there in the outer belt under artificial gravity and fluorescent light, who had never once seen Earth but still called themselves human. Gone. Not attacked, not damaged, not partially evacuated, gone. The Keth Dominion had sent 6 warships into a border sector that had been declared a protected civilian zone under the Conclave Settlement Act. They had not jammed the distress signal. They had not attempted to disguise what they were doing. The colony's emergency beacon had transmitted for 14 minutes before it went silent. 14 minutes of recorded audio, visual data, and atmospheric readings that anyone with a conclave frequency receiver could pull and review. They had wanted us to see it. That was the part that kept hitting me. They had not tried to hide it. This was a message. I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. I have been an ambassador for 9 years. Before that, I spent 6 years as a diplomatic attaché under Ambassador Lena Graves, who taught me that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation is not when someone gets angry, but when someone gets quiet. She said that anger is loud and spends itself. Quiet, she said, is where decisions are made that cannot be walked back. I was very quiet. I pulled up the personnel file for Kepler's Reach, not because I needed the numbers. I needed the faces. There were 17 school-aged children listed in the colony registry. A woman named Carol Hutton who had filed a community garden permit 6 weeks ago. A man named Gerald Oakes who had submitted a request for expanded communications bandwidth so that families could have better contact with Earth. Small, ordinary human things. The kind of things people do when they are building a life and expecting it to continue. My communicator chimed. It was Deputy Liaison Owen Hart from the Earth Diplomatic Office aboard Conclave Station. Ambassador Vasquez. His voice was flat. He had seen the feed too. The Council High Chair's office has already been in contact. They are requesting that all parties observe communication silence until a formal session can be convened. When is the session? 9 hours. 9 hours. I thought about that. I thought about what 9 hours of silence looked like compared to 14 minutes of a distress beacon. I will be at the session, I said. Ambassador, the High Chair's office also asked that you specifically, refrain from any public statements before the session. As a courtesy. Whose courtesy? Owen did not answer immediately. He was a good deputy, careful. He had been in galactic diplomacy long enough to understand what was being asked and why. The Keth delegation has already filed a request for a bilateral peace consultation, he said. The High Chair's office is treating this as a standard conflict de-escalation procedure. I set the communication feed on my secondary screen to run the Kepler's Reach beacon transmission from the beginning. I turned the audio off. I just watched the visual data scroll. I understand, I said. I will see you at the session. I ended the call. For the next 9 hours I did not issue any public statement. I honored that courtesy completely. What I did instead was work. I pulled every publicly available record on the Keth Dominion that the Conclave archives held. Incident reports, territorial disputes, resolved conflict summaries going back 230 years. I read each one. I cross-referenced the outcomes. I built a document. By the time I walked into the council chamber, I had not slept, but I had something better than sleep. I had clarity. The chamber of the Galactic Conclave was designed to make every species feel small. That was not an accident. The architects had understood something important about power, that a room which dwarfs you is a room that reminds you to be careful. The ceiling arched 4 stories overhead. The seating tiers rose in a wide spiral, each species assigned a position corresponding to their membership seniority. Humanity's seat was near the outer ring, which was the standard placement for junior members. We had held our seat for only 12 years. There were 41 species represented that morning. Some of them communicated through translator arrays that converted chemical signals or subsonic pulses into the conclave's common language. Some of them had been members of this body for longer than humanity had maintained written records. The room smelled faintly of atmospheric processors, cycling 36 different breathable compositions simultaneously. I took my seat. Owen sat beside me with his tablet and his careful face. The high chair, a Mavorian named Seldoreth whose species communicated through shifting patterns of bioluminescence, translated by a collar-mounted device into spoken language, opened the session with the standard procedural language. Acknowledgement of the incident, expression of concern, call for measured response. Then the Keth ambassador, a tall, gray-skinned figure named Voreth, took the floor. He was smooth. I will give him that. His translator rendered his speech in calm, measured tones. He expressed regret. He described the incident as a response to what he called unauthorized human military positioning near the Keth border. He said his government was prepared to engage in immediate peace consultations to prevent further misunderstanding. He used the word misunderstanding 4 times. He sat down. The room shifted. Several ambassadors were already preparing their remarks. I could see it. The rhythm of these sessions was familiar to everyone present. One party states their case, the other party states their case, the council facilitates a negotiated middle position, everyone files out. That was the pattern. That was what this room was built to produce. I stood up. In the conclave's procedural rules, any member ambassador may request the floor after an opening statement. It is rarely done before the chair formally opens the response period. I had read the rules thoroughly enough to know it was permitted. Seldoreth's bioluminescent collar flickered briefly. Ambassador Vasquez, the council acknowledges Earth. Every face in the room turned toward me. Some of them had seen humans speak in this chamber before. Most of them had never seen one stand up before the response period. I did not raise my voice. There was no need. The chamber's acoustics were excellent. The Keth ambassador used the word misunderstanding, I said. I want to address that word directly, because I think it is doing a great deal of work in a situation where it does not belong. I paused just long enough to let the translator arrays complete their cycle. 4,211 people lived on Kepler's Reach. The colony was established under Conclave Civilian Protection Charter. The Keth Dominion sent 6 warships to that location. They did not attempt to jam the colony's emergency beacon. They did not attempt to disguise the nature of their action. This was not a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is when 2 parties interpret the same information differently. What happened at Kepler's Reach was a deliberate act, conducted in full view of conclave monitoring systems, against an unarmed civilian population. I let that sit. The Keth ambassador has requested peace consultations. I want to be very clear about where humanity stands on that request. I looked at Voreth directly. He looked back with the particular kind of calm that comes from never having been refused before. We have nothing to discuss. Not today. Not until there is a formal accounting for what was done. Humanity does not sit across a table from those responsible for the deliberate destruction of our people and call it diplomacy. The chamber was absolutely silent. Not the polite, waiting silence of a room between speakers. The genuinely stunned silence of a room that had just heard something it did not expect and did not know how to process. I sat down. Owen's hand was very still on his tablet. He did not look at me. He looked straight ahead, the way people look when they are concentrating very hard on keeping their expression neutral. From the corner of my eye, I could see Seldoreth's bioluminescent collar cycling through colors I did not recognize. I had been told by a Mavorian cultural liaison early in my posting that rapid color cycling in a Mavorian indicated something between profound surprise and the specific discomfort of watching something happen that was supposed to be impossible. Voreth had stopped looking calm. It was a small change, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the shoulders that was slightly too controlled. He had expected a different room than the one he was sitting in. Good, I thought, let him sit with that. Across the chamber, the Vori elder, an ancient, slow-moving species whose members lived for centuries and who had been part of the conclave since its founding, turned her broad, pale face toward me. Her expression was unreadable. She had been the one to whisper to me 2 weeks ago, during a routine infrastructure session, that the Keth had done things like this before, that other species had absorbed the losses, that the conclave had a way of moving forward. I had remembered that conversation every hour since the alert came through. I was not interested in moving forward, not in the direction this room had always moved. When the session broke, 7 ambassadors requested private meetings with me. I accepted all of them. Owen walked beside me through the corridor outside the chamber, keeping pace, not speaking until we were past the main cluster of delegates making their way toward the transit corridors. That was not what the High Chair's office was hoping for, he said. No, I agreed. The Keth delegation is going to respond. They will, I said. I am counting on it. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are we doing, Ambassador?" I thought about Gerald Oakes and his request for better communication bandwidth. I thought about Carol Hutton's garden permit. I thought about 17 children whose names were in a registry that now read as historical record rather than a living population list. We are doing what should have been done a long time ago, I said. We are simply the first ones willing to say it. The first private meeting happened before I had even reached my office. Ambassador Siren of the Torathi Federation was waiting in the corridor outside the chamber's east wing, standing with the particular uprightness of someone who has been rehearsing what to say for at least 2 hours. The Torathi were one of the founding species of the conclave. They were also, by every available measure, one of the most carefully diplomatic civilizations in the known galaxy. They did not raise voices. They did not make scenes. They had been mediating conflicts between other species for 600 years. Siren fell into step beside me without waiting for an invitation. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said. His translator rendered his voice as warm and measured. "That was a remarkable statement." "Thank you. I mean that as an observation, not a compliment. Remarkable in the sense that it is going to create very significant complications for everyone in that room." "For everyone?" I asked. He paused for half a step. "For several parties," he amended. I stopped walking and turned to face him. Siren was tall, gray-blue, with the wide-set eyes his species used to track environmental changes across vast distances. He looked at me with what I had learned to recognize as genuine concern, rather than the performed concern that was much more common in diplomatic settings. "Tell me what you actually want to say," I said, "not the version you rehearsed." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the measured quality was still there, but something underneath it had shifted slightly. The Keth Dominion controls resource transit routes that 7 conclave species depend on. 3 of those species have no viable alternatives within their current economic infrastructure. If the conclave formally sanctions the Keth, or if a conflict escalates to the point where those routes are disrupted, there will be serious consequences for populations that have done nothing wrong and have nothing to do with what happened at Kepler's Reach. "I understand that," I said. "Do you?" "I do, and I am sorry for those populations, genuinely, but I need you to understand something too." I kept my voice even. If humanity sits at a peace table with the people responsible for what happened at Kepler's Reach, without accountability, without consequence, then we have established what a human life is worth in conclave space. We have told every species in that chamber, and every species watching from outside it, that human civilians can be targeted without cost. I cannot accept that. I will not accept that. Siren looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I had not expected. I know. We looked at each other in the corridor. I know, he said again, more quietly. You are not wrong. I simply needed you to understand what you are walking into. That was the first meeting. The second was less gentle. High Counselor Metharavan of the Dressy Compact arrived at my office 40 minutes later with 2 aides, and the energy of someone who had been given an assignment he found distasteful. The Dressy were an old, powerful species, not as old as the Vori, but old enough that they spoke in the conclave chambers with the easy authority of those who had never been told to wait their turn. Metharavan did not sit. He stood on the far side of my desk and spoke for 6 minutes with the careful precision of someone reading from a prepared argument. The points were well organized. The Keth, while regrettable in their actions, were a conclave-recognized sovereign body. Humanitarian concerns were valid but could not override conclave procedural norms. Bilateral peace consultations were the established mechanism. Humanity's position, while understandable given the emotional weight of the event, risked destabilizing a framework that had maintained relative galactic peace for over 300 years. He finished. He looked at me. I said, "How many times?" He blinked. "I am sorry." How many times has the Keth Dominion been involved in an incident like this one, not near human space, across all recorded conclave history? How many times? A very brief pause. There have been several documented disputes. 14, I said. 14 documented incidents over 230 years. In 4 of those incidents, the conclave records list civilian populations as having been, and I am quoting the archive language directly, significantly impacted. In each case, the outcome was a bilateral consultation process. In each case, the Keth returned to full standing within the conclave within 2 standard years, and in each case, within a decade, there was another incident. I kept my voice completely level. The framework you are describing as peaceful has produced 14 incidents and counting. I am not sure that is the argument you want to be making to me this morning. Metharavan's aides had gone very still. The High Counselor himself was quiet for a longer moment than I had expected from someone who had arrived with such prepared confidence. Then he said, "You have been doing your research." "I have been doing my job." After he left, Owen closed the door and turned to look at me. He had been in the corner of the room during the meeting, quiet and present as he always was. Owen Hart was 34 years old, had grown up in Leeds, and had joined the diplomatic service because his mother had been a translator, and he had inherited her belief that words could do work that weapons couldn't. He was one of the sharpest people I had ever worked with, and he was looking at me with an expression that combined respect with visible concern. "You know they are not going to stop," he said. "The visits, there will be more." "There will be 4 more today," I said. "I have already looked at the request queue." "And you are going to say the same thing to all of them?" "I am going to tell them the truth," I said. "What they do with it is their decision." Owen sat down in the chair across from my desk. He pulled up something on his tablet, then set the tablet face down, which was a thing he did when he wanted to have a conversation rather than a briefing. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Are we ready for what comes next? If the Keth escalate, if this doesn't resolve the way you are hopping, are we actually in a position where we can hold this line?" I pulled up the communication I had received early that morning, just before the council session. I turned my screen so he could read it. It was from Fleet Admiral George Calloway, commanding officer of Earth's 3rd Strategic Group, dated 5:40 shipboard time. It read, "Ambassador Vasquez, 3 carrier groups have repositioned to Sector 7 as of 400. Standard operational movement. No orders to advance. Positioning is visible on all standard conclave sensor feeds. Standing by. Owen read it twice, then he looked up at me. He moved them before the session, Owen said. Before the session, I confirmed. He expected this. George Calloway has been watching the Keth for 11 years, I said. He expected this before I did. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 carrier groups is a statement, not an action. That is exactly what it is meant to be. A statement, visible, readable, undeniable. I stood and walked to the narrow window that looked out across the docking rings of Conclave Station, where ships of 41 species cycled through on their ordinary business. We are not threatening anyone. We are making sure that everyone in this conversation understands that what happens next has real weight behind it, that we are not simply making noise. Some of them will interpret it as aggression. Some of them will, I agreed. Others will interpret it as seriousness. And I think there are more in that second group than the first if we give them a reason to stand in it. The next 3 meetings were versions of the first 2. Concern, economic arguments, framework arguments, the importance of stability, the danger of precedent. I listened to each one fully because that is what you owe people who come to you in good faith, even when they are asking you to do something you cannot do. And some of them were genuinely speaking in good faith. That made it harder, not easier. The meeting that changed something was the last one that evening. Ambassador Preth of the Yanali Collective arrived alone, without aides. The Yanali were a small species by galactic standards. Their home system had 3 inhabited stations and a population of roughly 400 million, which in interstellar terms was modest. They had been conclave members for 80 years. They were known primarily for their work in environmental monitoring systems and for being, by universal reputation, very quiet. Preth sat down without being invited and without preamble. "I am not here to ask you to stop," she said. I waited. "I am here because 22 years ago, the Keth conducted an operation against a Yanali deep space research installation, 47 researchers. The conclave record lists the outcome as an unresolved territorial dispute leading to accidental engagement." She set a data chip on my desk. Small, plain. That is not what the Yanali record shows. I looked at the chip but did not touch it yet. "My government filed a formal complaint with the Conclave Council 8 months after the incident," Preth continued. "We were advised that pursuing the matter formally would create more instability than it would resolve. We were advised to consider the long-term relationship with a major conclave power. We were told, in very careful language, that this was simply the cost of existing in a complex galactic community." She stopped. The room was very quiet. "We accepted it," she said, "because we were small and we were afraid, and we did not think anyone would stand with us." She looked at me steadily. "I am watching to see if that was the correct calculation, or if it was simply the calculation that was easier at the time." I picked up the data chip. "I will read everything on this," I said, "tonight." Preth nodded once and stood. She was nearly at the door when I spoke again. 47 researchers, I said. "I am sorry, that should have been answered a long time ago." She paused with her hand near the door. She did not turn around. "Yes," she said quietly, "it should have been." After she left, Owen and I sat in silence for a moment. Then I picked up my communicator and connected to Fleet Admiral Calloway's line. When he answered, I said, "Keep the carrier groups where they are. Make sure their positioning stays visible. And George, do not move them forward without my direct order. This is going to take a few more days, and I need everyone to understand that we are serious, not reckless." "Understood," Calloway said. His voice had the particular steadiness of a man who has been waiting for a reason to be steadfast. "We are here, Ambassador." "I know," I said. "That helps more than you know." I set down the communicator. I picked up the data chip from Preth. I read everything on it. It took most of the night. By the time the light from the station's rotation cycle shifted to the pale blue of its artificial morning, I had read Preth's files, cross-referenced them with the Conclave archives, and started building a second document alongside the first one I had compiled the night before. The document was growing. The longer I worked on it, the heavier it became, not because of the data itself, but because of what the data revealed in the spaces between the formal language. 14 incidents. Filed. Noted. Archived. Moved past. I thought about the Vari Elder's warning on my first week aboard this station. The Keth have done this before. Other species learn to absorb the loss. You will too. I had thought at the time that she was simply being pragmatic. An old species in an old institution, offering the wisdom of endurance. I was beginning to think she might have been describing a trap. One that the Conclave had been caught in for 200 years and had simply stopped recognizing as a trap because they had been inside it for so long. I filed a formal request that evening for an extended floor session in 3 days' time. The subject line read, Pattern of Conduct Request for Formal Conclave Review. The High Chair's office responded within the hour. The response acknowledged receipt of my request, noted that it had been referred to the procedural committee, and strongly suggested that the human delegation might consider whether this course of action served the best interests of a productive resolution. I sent back a one-line reply, I believe it does. I will see you at the session. Then I made one more call. It was to a contact I had cultivated quietly during my first year aboard the station, a woman in the Conclave's public communications division named Nora Whitfield, who was responsible for managing the broadcast feeds from official sessions. I did not ask her to do anything outside her normal duties. I simply confirmed that the extended floor session in 3 days would be broadcast on the standard open Conclave feed, available to all member species and their public networks. She confirmed that it would be. Good, I thought. I was not going to fight this in the back corridors and private offices where so much of this had been buried for so long. I was going to say what I had to say in the open, where every species in the Conclave and every one of their populations watching from home could hear it. The Keth had wanted their message seen. I was going to make sure mine was too. They moved on the second day. I was in the middle of a conversation with Siren of the Torathi Federation. A real conversation, not the managed one from the day before, when Owen appeared in the doorway of the small conference room I had been using for private meetings. His face had the specific quality it got when something had happened that required immediate attention, but he did not want to interrupt me in a way that signaled alarm to whoever else was in the room. I excused myself. In the corridor, Owen handed me his tablet without saying anything. The Keth Ambassador Vorath had called a press session with the Conclave's open media feeds, the same feeds that broadcast official sessions to every member species. It was an unusual move. Ambassadors of major powers rarely used the open press format. It was considered the tool of smaller delegations who needed public attention to compensate for limited institutional weight. The fact that Vorath had used it meant he had decided that the standard back-channel management approach was not producing the results he wanted fast enough. Owen had the transcript already running. Vorath had stood before the Conclave media array and delivered a 15-minute statement. I read it in approximately 4 minutes, which is how long it takes when you are reading for the specific load-bearing phrases rather than the surrounding language. The key paragraph was near the end. In it, Vorath stated that the Keth Dominion's patience with what he described as provocative human military positioning near Keth sovereign space had been severely tested. He stated that if the Conclave did not move the human delegation toward a peace consultation framework within a reasonable period, the Keth Dominion would be compelled to take steps to secure its own borders. He used the phrase, expand our security perimeter. Every diplomat in Conclave space knew what that phrase meant. It had been used before, twice in the archived conclave records. In the lead-up to 2 of the 14 incidents I had cataloged. I handed the tablet back to Owen. "Call Calloway," I said. "Tell him to run a full sensor sweep of the Keth border and push the results to my screen in the next 30 minutes." "Already sent the request," Owen said. He anticipated it. I walked back into the conference room. Siren was still there, sitting with the patient quality his species was known for. He had clearly read something on his own device while I was in the corridor. His expression had changed. "You saw it," I said. "Yes," he paused. "This is the part where things typically become very difficult to manage." "Difficult for whom?" Siren looked at me carefully. "For everyone who is not the Keth." I sat back down across from him. "Siren, I want to ask you something that I need you to answer honestly, not diplomatically." He was still for a moment, then inclined his head. "You have been in this institution for 30 years, I said. The Torathi have been members for 400. In your personal estimation, not the official Torathi position, your own, do you believe that a peace consultation right now, on the Keth's terms and timeline, will prevent the next incident? Not delay it. Prevent it." He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "Then help me," I said. "Not with a statement, not publicly, not yet. Just tell me who else in this building has been waiting for someone to make this case. Tell me who is angry and has been silent about it." Siren looked at the table between us for a moment, then he looked up. "I will need 24 hours. "You have them," I said. The session with the full council convened that afternoon, called by the high chair at short notice. The purpose, as filed in the procedural notification, was to address the evolving situation following Voreth's press statement. In conclave language, evolving situation was how you described something that was getting worse in a way that required management rather than resolution. The chamber was full, every delegation present. The atmospheric processors were working hard. Voreth spoke first. He used the same smooth, measured tone. He reiterated the points from his press statement with slight elaboration. He emphasized the 3 carrier groups that Earth's fleet had repositioned to Sector 7, describing them as a threat to regional stability. He expressed the Keth Dominion's sincere desire for peaceful resolution. He said the word sincere 3 times. Then several ambassadors spoke in the middle space that emerges in these sessions when many parties have things to say, but no one is quite ready to say the sharpest version of them. Concerns about escalation, calls for restraint from all sides, references to conclave procedural frameworks. Then the high chair recognized me. I had spent the previous 90 minutes preparing, not preparing remarks, because what I had to say did not require many words. Preparing the delivery. Preparing for the specific quality of attention I would need to hold, because what I was about to do was going to change the temperature of the room very quickly, and I needed to stay cooler than the room when that happened. I stood. "The Keth ambassador has described Earth's fleet positioning as a threat," I began. "I want to spend a moment on that characterization, because I think it is instructive." I took a breath. 3 carrier groups, positioned openly on publicly visible sensor feeds, operating in international space, under full conclave monitoring protocols, with no advance toward any sovereign border. This is what Ambassador Voreth has described as provocative. 3 carrier groups in open space is a threat. I paused. 6 warships sent into a declared civilian protection zone, destroying a settlement of 4,200 civilians, with the emergency beacon left active so that the entire conclave community could watch in real time. This, Ambassador Voreth described as a response to misunderstanding. The room was very still. I continued. "I want to give this chamber some specific information, because I think several of the parties present may find it useful." I called up the document I had been building for 2 days on my data display, but I did not share it to the chamber feed yet. I simply stood with it ready. Earth's third strategic group operates 3 carrier-class vessels. Each carrier deploys a standard complement of 240 combat craft of varying categories. The vessels themselves carry long-range precision systems with a demonstrated operational range that covers the entirety of Keth sovereign space from their current position. This is not a claim. This is publicly filed fleet specification data available to any conclave member through standard channels. I let the translator arrays complete their cycle, 41 species, every one of them processing the same words. In addition to the third strategic group, Earth maintains a second and first group in reserve positioning. Our combined available force, at current readiness levels, represents a sustained operational capacity that our own historians would note has been applied, over several periods of our history, for durations measured in years rather than months. We are not a species that begins things it is not prepared to finish. The room had gone beyond still. It had gone into that specific quality of silence where people are not quiet because they have nothing to say, but because they are processing something that does not fit easily into categories they already have. Voreth had not moved. He was watching me with an expression that had lost the careful smoothness it had carried since his arrival at this station. Behind his eyes there was something working, recalculating. "I want to be very clear about what none of this is," I said. "This is not a threat. Earth is not threatening the Keth Dominion. We have not moved our fleet forward. We have not made a demand for military action. We are not asking this council for permission to take any aggressive step." I looked directly at Voreth. But the Keth ambassador has used the phrase, "expand our security perimeter," in a public statement today. I am sure every party in this chamber understands the operational meaning of that phrase, and I want to make certain that the Keth Dominion has a complete and accurate picture of what expanding a security perimeter in the direction of human-settled space would mean, not as a rhetorical position, as a practical reality. I held his gaze. "Ambassador Voreth, you have mistaken our patience for weakness. We were waiting to see what you would do when someone stood in front of you and declined to move. Now you know." I sat down. The chamber erupted. Not in shouting. The conclave had translation protocols that made simultaneous shouting something closer to a layered wave of sound, but in the kind of sudden multiple-party crosstalk that only happened when a room full of carefully managed professional diplomats had collectively lost their grip on composure for 30 seconds. Seldoreth's bioluminescent collar was cycling through colors at a rate I had never seen before. Voreth had stopped speaking mid-sentence. I know because Owen told me afterward that he had been in the process of beginning a rebuttal when I said the final line and had simply stopped, not paused, stopped, and had not restarted. That detail mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened in that chamber. Because the Keth Dominion had been operating for 200 years on the foundational assumption that the species they were dealing with would manage themselves into compliance, that the structures of the conclave, the economic dependencies, the fear of disruption, the desire for stability, would always produce a room full of parties who wanted peace badly enough to accept almost any terms. And for 200 years, that assumption had been correct. The thing that breaks a 200-year assumption is not necessarily a large thing. Sometimes it is a person standing up in a room and saying, plainly, that the assumption no longer holds, and saying it in a way that is impossible to reframe as emotional or impulsive or an aberration that will pass. Calm is harder to dismiss than anger. Specifics are harder to dismiss than rhetoric. And a room full of other parties who had been quietly holding their own archived injuries and waiting to see what happened next, that was harder to dismiss than anything. I did not look at the other delegations around the room as the crosstalk settled, but I heard, in the general noise, at least 3 separate translator-rendered voices saying things that were not directed at the chair and were not part of the official record. One of them was from the Yanali section of the chamber. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the direction. Preth, I thought, good. Owen leaned close and said very quietly, 3 separate ambassadors just filed floor time requests in the last 2 minutes. Which 3? I asked. He told me. I had not expected all 3 of them. One was a surprise. One was a small nation I had not managed to meet with yet. And one was the Vori elder, whose species had not requested independent floor time in the conclave chamber in 40 years. Outside the chamber, after the session broke, I walked the long corridor toward the transit ring without hurrying. My communicator vibrated. It was Calloway. Keth fleet movement detected, he said without preamble. 2 warships pulled back from the Sector 12 position they have held for the past 6 months, not toward us, back toward Keth sovereign space. I absorbed that. Keep me updated, I said. There's more, Calloway said. We are picking up what looks like internal Keth communications traffic at elevated levels. We cannot decrypt it, but the volume is 3 times the standard baseline. Something happening inside the Keth Dominion. Conversations, arguments, the particular activity of an institution that has just received information that requires it to reconsider its position. Understood, I said. Hold the groups where they are, no movement. Yes, Ambassador. I ended the call. Owen was walking beside me. He said nothing for a moment then. They are not going to thank you for this. Even the ones who are glad it is happening. They will not say it publicly. They do not need to thank me, I said. They need to walk through the door when I open it. And if they don't? I thought about Preth sitting across from me with a data chip containing 47 names. I thought about Siren saying I know in a corridor, and meaning something that his institution had not allowed him to say aloud for 30 years. Some of them will, I said. That is enough. The queue outside my door began at 700. I had slept for 4 hours. That was deliberate. I had set an alarm because I knew what the day was going to require, and I had learned a long time ago that the night before something important was exactly the wrong time to let yourself stay awake reading and rereading your own arguments until they started to sound uncertain. I slept for 4 hours, woke up, ate something, and reviewed the 3 items that mattered most. The first item was the floor time requests filed in the final minutes of the previous session. 7 of them, by the time the count was finalized overnight. 7 separate delegations requesting time in the next extended session, which was now scheduled for tomorrow morning rather than the 3-day timeline I had originally requested. The High Chair's office had moved it forward. I took that as a sign that things were moving faster than even I had anticipated. The second item was a communication from Calloway, sent at 3:30, nodding that the internal Keth communications traffic had continued at elevated volume through the night, and that 2 additional warships had returned from forward positions to standard harbor positions within Keth space. Not a withdrawal, not a retreat, but a shift in posture. The ships were moving back to where they could be recalled, resupplied, and reconfigured. The Keth military structure was doing the thing military structures do when command-level decisions are being reconsidered. It was making itself available to receive new orders. The third item was a brief encrypted message from Siren of the Torathi Federation. It contained no text, only an attachment, a list of 6 names, 6 ambassadors, with a single notation next to each one that read, willing to speak. 6 species willing to speak. 6 sets of injuries that had been filed, noted, archived, and moved past. I read the list twice, then set it aside and went to the door. The first person waiting outside was not an ambassador. It was a junior attaché from the Pelhari delegation, a young species who had only been conclave members for 30 years, carrying a sealed data packet and looking slightly nervous in the way of someone who has been given an important task and is aware of its weight. She handed me the packet, and said her ambassador requested a private meeting at my earliest convenience. She left quickly. After her came Ambassador Gorin of the Surath Union. The Surath were a mid-tier species by most measurements, medium population, medium territorial extent, medium institutional history. They were known in conclave circles primarily for their exceptionally detailed record-keeping. Every interaction, every negotiation, every filed complaint, every resolution. The Surath kept records the way some species built monuments, as a way of insisting that the past was not allowed to disappear. Gorin was a short, compact individual with 4 upper limbs, 2 of which he typically kept folded when in professional settings. When he sat down in the chair across from my desk, all 4 limbs were active, which I had learned was a Surath indicator of heightened engagement. He placed a physical data storage unit on my desk. It was old, physical storage was not commonly used anymore, and it was thick. "Our archive," he said, "not the formal conclave submission, our archive. Everything we recorded, everything we observed, everything we were told would be inadvisable to raise formally." He looked at me directly. "There are 9 incidents in there. 9, over 140 years. 9 incidents involving the Surath alone." "Why are you bringing this to me now?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "Because you are the first person to say what everyone in this building has been thinking for a very long time," Gorin said. "And when someone finally says the unsayable thing out loud in a room full of people, you have a choice. You can pretend you didn't hear it, or you can stop pretending." He looked at the storage unit between us. "I have been carrying that for 11 years. It weighs more than it should for a data object." I accepted the storage unit with both hands, which Owen had told me early in my posting was considered a sign of genuine reception among Surath. Gorin's expression shifted slightly. The meetings continued through the morning. Ambassador Rel of the Chivik Assembly arrived with a single aide and spoke for 40 minutes. The Chivik were known for their engineering expertise and for having suffered a border incident with the Keth 28 years ago that the conclave record classified as a navigational error. Rel explained, precisely and without visible emotion, what the navigational error had actually destroyed. It was not a military installation. It was a research vessel, 31 people. The Chivik had filed a formal claim. The claim had been routed through 7 procedural committees and had never reached a final determination. "I stopped expecting it to reach a determination," Rel said. "I did not stop recording the fact that it had not." Ambassador Wynne of the Pelhari, the young species whose attaché had been the first person at my door, arrived for her own meeting 2 hours later. She was young by ambassador standards, had been appointed only 2 years ago, and had the particular quality of someone who had grown up being told that the way things were was simply the way things were, and had recently decided that was not a sufficient explanation. She brought no formal records, no data chips, no archived complaints. She brought herself. "We do not have a documented incident," she said. "We have never been directly targeted by the Keth, but we have watched them move against our neighbors, and we have sat in the chamber sessions afterward and listened to the managed language, and I want you to know that we see it. We have always seen it. We just did not know what to do about it." She paused. "Now we might." I thanked her for coming. She looked, when she left, slightly lighter than she had when she arrived. The meeting I had most expected came in the early afternoon. The Vori elder arrived alone. This was itself unusual. The Vori, as the oldest active conclave species, always moved with what could generously be described as a ceremonial presence. Junior Vori members serving as escorts, formal attire, the particular gravitational weight of a species that had been part of every major conclave development for longer than most current members had been spacefaring. She came alone. She walked slowly, as her species always did, but there was a quality to her movement that was not the careful stateliness I had observed in formal sessions. It was something closer to purpose. She sat down. She looked at me for a moment before speaking. I told you when you first arrived at this station that the Keth had done this before, she said. Her translator rendered her voice as low and even, which I had been told was accurate to her actual vocal register. I told you other species had absorbed the loss. I told you the conclave moved forward. You did, I said. I want you to understand what I meant when I said that. She was quiet for a moment. I was not endorsing it. I was warning you that it was coming. I was watching to see if you would accept it the way others had. She paused. You did not. No. She reached into the fold of her garment. The Vori wore layered ceremonial wrappings that served a social function I had never fully decoded, and placed a data chip on my desk. It was slightly different from Preth's chip, older in its format specifications. This was given to the Conclave Council High Chair's predecessor 41 years ago, she said. It contains internal Keth Dominion operational planning documents obtained through channels that I will not describe in detail. What they show is that the incidents categorized in the Conclave archive as border disputes, accidental engagements, and security responses were not any of those things. They were planned. They were deliberate policy decisions made at the highest levels of Keth governance. They were conducted with the expectation that the conclave response would be managed into a peace consultation, because that had always been the conclave response. I looked at the chip. The current High Chair has a copy, the Vori elder said. The High Chair before him had a copy. This information has been in institutional possession for 41 years. The room was very quiet. 41 years, I said. The calculation that was made each time was that confronting the Keth with this information would cause a larger destabilization than absorbing the individual incidents, that the damage from disrupting the Keth's conclave standing would exceed the damage already done. She met my eyes. I disagreed with that calculation. I have disagreed with it for a long time, but I am very old, and I have learned that disagreeing with an institution from the inside alone changes very little. And now, I asked. Now you have 7 delegations filing floor requests, she said. Now you have a room full of people who have been waiting to stop pretending. That is not the same situation. She stood slowly. I will speak tomorrow. I wanted you to know that, and I wanted you to know why. After she left, Owen and I sat in silence for a long moment. Then Owen said, very quietly, "The High Chair has had those documents for 41 years. Yes, I said. And he was in that chamber when you made your first statement, when you said we have nothing to discuss. He sat there knowing what he knows. Yes, I said again. Owen was quiet for another moment. Then he said something I had not heard from him in 9 years of working together. I am genuinely angry. So am I said. Use it carefully. That evening, I drafted the motion. I had been thinking about its structure for 2 days. It needed to do specific things. It needed to be grounded in conclave procedural law, because a motion that could be dismissed on procedural grounds would be dismissed, and the moment would be lost. It needed to be co-signable, which meant it needed to be written in language that 7 different species and their legal translation teams could review and attach their names to without requiring them to use words their own political situations couldn't bear. And it needed to say what it actually meant without the kind of managed softening that would allow it to be absorbed into the conclave's long tradition of filing things away. I worked on it for 3 hours. The motion called for the formal suspension of the Keth Dominion's conclave seat, pending an independent tribunal investigation into documented incidents across a 200-year period, to include examination of all archived records in conclave institutional possession relevant to those incidents. That last clause was the one that mattered most, because it pulled the documents the High Chair had been sitting on into the formal record. It made them, by definition, part of the tribunal's scope. It made the suppression of those documents part of the story being told. I sent the draft to Siren first. He read it and sent back 2 suggested amendments, both of which strengthened rather than softened the procedural language. I incorporated them. Then I sent it to Preth, Gorin, Rel, Wynn, and 2 others from Siren's list. Each of them responded within 2 hours. By midnight, I had 7 co-signatories. I filed the motion at 45 station time. Formal co-signatories, 8 delegations. Humanity, the Yanali Collective, the Sureth Union, the Chivik Assembly, the Pelhari, the Torathi Federation, the Dressi, who surprised me, Metharavan having apparently had a change of heart after our second conversation, and the Vori. The Vori's co-signature meant something beyond its procedural weight. The Vori had been conclave members since the founding. Their institutional credibility was, in the language of this body, essentially absolute. When the Vori signed something, it was not merely political. It was historical. Owen filed the confirmation receipt, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "The High Chair's office is going to be awake right now," he said. "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult." "Tomorrow is going to be important," I said. "Difficult and important are not the same thing." I sent a final message to Calloway. Motion filed, 8 co-signatories, session tomorrow, hold position. He replied within minutes, holding, "This is something, Ambassador." I looked at that message for a moment. It is, I thought, I'm not sure exactly what yet, but it is something. I thought about the Vori elder walking across the chamber floor alone. I thought about Gorin and his physical storage unit and 11 years of wait. I thought about Preth saying we accepted it because we were small and afraid. I thought about 47 researchers and 4,211 names and a garden permit and a bandwidth request and 17 children. I thought about the moment when the right thing to do and the possible thing to do become the same thing, and how rarely in history those 2 things have arrived in the same room at the same time. I turned off my desk screen and went to get my second 4 hours of sleep. Tomorrow, I needed to be the calmest person in that room, and the room was going to be very loud. The session was scheduled for 900. By 7:30, the corridor outside the chamber was full. Not with the normal morning traffic of delegations making their way to assigned seats in the orderly, unhurried way of people who attend institutional proceedings regularly and regard them as routine. Full in the way of a place where something is about to happen that everyone present knows will matter. Attachés carrying data devices. Senior aides standing in clusters with the tight-shouldered quality of people relaying information in real time. A cluster of conclave press credentials near the east entrance, larger than any session press pool I had seen in 12 years. Owen walked beside me and said nothing. He had been doing that more as the days had progressed, talking less and observing more, which in my experience was what thoughtful people did when they could feel that a situation had moved past the point where more words were the useful contribution. I walked into the chamber at 8:45. My seat felt different than it had on the first day of my posting, not the seat itself, something about occupying it. Every seat in the chamber was filled. Seldoreth opened the session at precisely 900. His bioluminescent collar was running slow, steady pulses of deep blue, which I had been told by my Mavorian cultural consultant indicated a state of concentrated formal gravity. He read the procedural preamble in full, which he sometimes condensed in shorter sessions. He did not condense it today. Then he formally acknowledged the motion filed by the Earth delegation and co-signed by 7 additional member delegations, and opened the floor to response. Voreth stood immediately. He had prepared extensively. I could see it in the particular quality of his posture, the kind of controlled readiness that comes from rehearsing under pressure. He spoke for 11 minutes. He challenged the procedural basis of the motion. He cited conclave charter language regarding the sovereignty of member states. He argued that a suspension mechanism had never been used against a founding tier member, and that doing so would create a precedent that could be selectively weaponized by any coalition of smaller states against any powerful member in the future. He was articulate, organized, and occasionally sharp. He was also arguing against something he knew was already in the room. Because when he finished, Seldoreth did not move immediately to my response. He moved to the queue of floor requests. The Vori elder spoke first. She stood slowly, the way she always moved, and the chamber that was already quiet became a different kind of quiet. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not describe the archived documents yet. Those would come in tribunal proceedings, not here. What she described was 41 years of institutional decisions. She used precise language. She said the conclave had been in possession of information that would have changed the nature of the relationship with the Keth Dominion had it been formally introduced, and that it had not been formally introduced, and that the motion before the chamber was therefore not a radical act but a correction. When the Vori elder finishes a statement, no one speaks immediately. It is not a rule. It is simply how the room responds. Then Preth of the Yanali spoke. She described the 47 researchers in her clean, factual way. She described the 8 months of formal complaint procedures. She described the language she had been given about cost and complexity and regional stability. She said she was prepared to enter the Yanali's full records into the tribunal process. Then Goran of the Surath. 9 incidents, 140 years. He read the count into the formal record and let it stand without elaboration, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say in a room is the plain thing. Rel of the Chivik described the research vessel. He described the 31 people on it. He said their names, all 31. The translator array rendered each name in the conclave's common language. It took a little over 4 minutes. The chamber did not move. Then Win of the Pelhari, who had said she had no documented incident, stood and said something different from everyone else. She said the conclave was a body that had been built on the principle that smaller species could exist in safety alongside more powerful ones, because the community would hold the line. She said that principle was the reason her species had applied for membership. She said that if the conclave could not hold that line, it was worth less than the infrastructure it was built to protect. She sat down. She was 29 years old, and she had just said the clearest thing that had been said in that chamber in a very long time. By the time the floor reached me, the room had already shifted. Not all the way, not unanimously, but the weight had moved. I stood. Ambassador Vorith raised a concern about precedent, I said. I want to address that directly because I think he is correct that this motion sets a precedent. A tribunal investigation into a pattern of deliberate actions against civilian populations, sustained over 200 years, with documentation in institutional possession. Yes, that is a precedent. I believe it is the right precedent. I believe this body was built to set exactly this precedent, and has simply not done so until now. I looked around the chamber, not at Vorith, at everyone else. No one in this room wants conflict. No one in this room is asking for it. This motion does not authorize military action. It does not end diplomatic channels. It authorizes an investigation conducted under conclave procedural law with full evidentiary process to determine the facts of a documented pattern. That is what legal accountability looks like. That is the thing that separates a community of law from a community of power. I paused. The Keth Dominion has a choice, I said. They can participate in a tribunal process, present their evidence, challenge the findings, and engage with accountability in the way that any member of a law-governed community does. That is available to them. Or they can refuse, and in refusing, tell every species in this chamber exactly what kind of institution they have always understood themselves to be. I sat down. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing in the conclave ever was. But when Seldoreth called the formal count, the motion passed with 26 voting in favor, 9 abstaining, and 6 opposed. The 6 opposed were all species with direct economic dependencies on Keth resource routes, and 3 of them sent private communications to my office within the hour, acknowledging the result and expressing interest in discussing alternatives to those dependencies. Vorath sat through the count without moving. When the result was declared, he stood. He had the contained quality of someone managing a very large internal reaction. He spoke briefly. A formal objection entered into the record, a statement that the Keth Dominion did not recognize the legitimacy of the process, a reservation of all rights. Then he said, "The human delegation has brought this body to the edge of something it cannot walk back from. When the consequences become clear, they will be on your hands." He left the chamber. I did not respond while he was still in the room. I waited until his delegation had filed out, which took about 90 seconds, and then I stood once more. "The conclave record should note," I said, "that the human delegation accepts responsibility for this motion entirely. We co-filed it with 7 partners whose courage I will not minimize by calling it our action alone. But if there is to be a consequence, we will stand in it." I paused. "That is what it means to be serious." I sat down for the last time. The following 72 hours moved in ways I had not entirely anticipated, though in retrospect I should have seen some of it coming. The first development was military. Callaway contacted me 14 hours after the vote with news that the Keth Dominion's remaining forward fleet positions, 5 vessels that had been holding near the outer edge of human-settled space since the Kepler's Reach incident, had reversed course. Not back to home space entirely, but to a position well inside their own territorial boundary. The shift was quiet, no announcement, no statement, no acknowledgement. The ship simply moved. Callaway described it as the kind of movement you make when you are deciding whether a war is worth it, and the numbers are not coming out in your favor. I agreed with his assessment. The second development was political, and it came from inside the Keth Dominion itself. 48 hours after the vote, a communication arrived through the conclave's secure diplomatic channel. It was from a faction within the Keth governing structure that described itself, in the careful language of internal political distancing, as the Council of Moderate Voices. They expressed, without using the word apology, a commitment to cooperative engagement with the tribunal process. They indicated that they were prepared to identify and make available 2 senior military commanders, whose authority and decision-making had been central to the Kepler's Reach operation. 2 names, submitted voluntarily, from inside the Keth Dominion. Owen read the communication 3 times and then said, "They fractured." "The pressure was already there," I said. There were Keth political figures who understood that the approach Vorath was representing was going to eventually cost them more than it produced. They just needed a moment when the cost became impossible to ignore. "You gave them that moment." "The coalition gave them that moment," I said. "One species, even with 3 carrier groups, is a manageable problem. 8 species, including the Vori, moving together in a conclave vote, that is a different kind of pressure entirely." The third development was the one that had been building since the day I arrived at Conclave Station, and had simply needed the right moment to become visible. High Counselor Metharevan came to see me privately the morning after the Keth communication arrived. He came alone, without aides. He sat down with the weight of someone carrying something they have been carrying for a long time. He told me that the High Chair, Seldoreth's institutional predecessor in the administrative structure, not the current chair, but the one who had held administrative oversight for the past 18 years while Seldoreth managed the ceremonial sessions, was announcing an early retirement. The announcement would be made formally the following day. The given reason was health. Metharevan told me the real reason. The documents the Vori elder had brought to my office were, as she had stated, already in institutional possession, specifically in administrative possession. The administrative layer of the conclave, distinct from the ceremonial chair role, was responsible for managing the archive access protocols. The incoming documents from the Council of Moderate Voices, combined with the Vori's public statement, had created a situation where the question of who had known what and when was going to receive formal scrutiny. The administrative officer had calculated, correctly, that retiring before the tribunal convened was the better option. I thanked Metharavan for telling me. He stood, he looked at me for a moment. "When you first filed that motion," he said, "I believed you were going to damage something that had taken centuries to build." "And now," I asked. "Now I believe you may be repairing something that has been damaged for a very long time and that we had simply stopped noticing." He paused. "I do not know that I would have had the courage to do what you did. I want you to know that I understand what it cost." "It cost less than Kepler's reach," I said. He nodded and left. The tribunal was formally constituted 11 days after the vote. It was chaired by a Torathi jurist. Siren had put the name forward, and no one objected, because the Torathi's record-keeping on procedural fairness was beyond dispute. The two Keth commanders were transferred to conclave custody within 3 weeks, handed over by the Council of Moderate Voices with a formal statement that drew a careful line between their faction's decisions and the actions being investigated. It was not a perfect process. It was not a clean resolution. The Keth Dominion's conclave relationship was going to be complicated for years, and the economic dependencies that species like the Torathi and the Dressi had raised as concerns were real and would require real work to address. 3 of the 6 abstaining species came to me over the following 2 weeks, separately and quietly, to begin conversations about those alternatives. I took every meeting. The Keth did not fire a single additional shot. Not then, not in the months that followed, not while the tribunal gathered its evidence, not while the procedural timeline moved through its careful stages. The ships that had pulled back stayed back. The diplomatic channels that Vorith had slammed with his departure were reopened by other Keth representatives, lower in the hierarchy and notably more careful in their language. The thing that I had said in the chamber, that the Keth could engage with the process as a member of a law-governed community, was not a rhetorical offer. It was a genuine one. And slowly, through channels that were less public than the chamber sessions and more tedious than anything I can make sound dramatic, they began to take it. 3 months after the vote, I was standing at the observation window in my office late in the evening when Owen appeared in the doorway. "The Vori elder has requested a meeting," he said, "informal, at her preferred location in the botanical ring." I smiled slightly. "Tell her I will be there." The botanical ring was one of the few parts of Conclave Station that had been designed for rest rather than function. A long, curved corridor lined with growing things from a dozen different worlds, maintained under overlapping atmospheric zones. It was where members came when they needed to think without the weight of the chambers. The Vori elder was already there when I arrived, standing near a cluster of tall plants with pale, wide leaves that came from a world I did not know the name of. She was very still in the way of someone who has been still for a long time and finds it natural. I stood beside her. We were quiet together for a little while. Outside the wide observation panels, the stars were where they always were. "My species," she said eventually, "has been part of this institution since its founding, 340 years. In that time I have watched many things happen in those chambers." She paused. "I have watched very few things happen that I believed would still matter in another 340 years. I did not say anything. "This one will," she said. I looked at the stars for a moment. I thought about Kepler's reach. I thought about Carol Hutton's garden and Gerald Oakes and 17 children who had not grown up to see whatever was being built here. I thought about 47 Yanali researchers and 31 Chivik scientists and 9 Sureth incidents and decades of careful archived silence. "The work isn't finished," I said. "No," the Vori elder said. "It is not. It never is. She turned slightly toward me. What do you intend to do with the position you now hold in this institution? It was a real question, not ceremonial. She wanted to know. I had thought about it, not in terms of political leverage or strategic positioning, the way diplomats were trained to think about accumulated standing. In simpler terms. The same thing we do everywhere, I said. Hold the line. She was quiet for a moment. I believe you, she said. I think you are right too. We stood at the window for a while longer. The station rotated slowly, as it always did, and the stars moved across the panels in their patient arc. Somewhere behind us, in the archive levels of the conclave building, a tribunal was organizing its evidence. 2 Keth commanders were in custody. A retirement had been announced. 8 delegations had signed their names to something together and found, on the other side of that signature, that they were no longer alone. A species that had been told for 12 years to wait its turn had stood up in a room full of the oldest powers in the galaxy and declined to move. 4,211 people could not be brought back. I knew that. I carried it every day and would carry it for as long as I lived. But they would be answered for, that I was certain of. And the next time, because there were always those who looked at the conclave and saw a room full of careful, manageable parties. The next time someone decided to send a message by leaving a beacon active so the galaxy could watch, they would remember what the galaxy had done when it watched. They would remember that humanity had stood up. They would remember what happened to the assumption that we wouldn't. I stood at the window until the station had turned far enough that the sector where Kepler's reach had been came into view, a dark patch of space with nothing visible in it from this distance, just stars and the quiet dark between them. I stayed there until I was ready to go back to work. Then I did.